No food in the stores, no fuel for the stoves, no way out. In the fall of 1944, this was the reality for 4.5 million people in the occupied Netherlands. A German blockade had cut off all food and fuel shipments to the western provinces, plunging a modern urbanized society into a medieval famine known as the Hongerwinter. As the calories dropped from 1,400 a day to 900 and then to less than 500, families were forced to make impossible choices. The city became a concrete desert, and survival depended on eating things that were never meant for human consumption. Every meal was a risk. One mistaken preparation, one poisonous plant, and the meal designed to save your life could be the one that ended it. These weren't recipes, they were desperate chemical processes, battlefield engineering applied in the kitchen. How did Dutch families transform toxic flowers and industrial crops into edible food? What were the exact step-by-step methods they used to find calories where none existed? And what forgotten knowledge did they rely on when official systems collapsed entirely? Today, we're breaking down the 5 desperate foods that Dutch families were forced to eat to survive the brutal hunger winter of 1944. Survival isn't theory, it's history. This is the Prepper Age. Number 1. Tulip bulbs. In a nation famous for its flowers, the tulip bulb became the most iconic symbol of the hunger winter. But eating a tulip bulb wasn't as simple as digging it up. Raw tulip bulbs are toxic, unpalatable, and cause severe throat and stomach pain. Turning this ornamental plant into a source of calories was a technical process born of pure desperation. The first critical step was identification and selection. Not all flower bulbs are edible. Hyacinths and daffodils, for example, are highly poisonous. Families had to know with absolute certainty that they were digging up tulips. Because pesticides were not widely used on a large scale for bulbs at the time, this was less of a concern, but knowledge was still key. The bulbs were distributed by the government and sold by farmers who saw their export market collapse, creating a sudden, non-traditional food supply. The preparation process was a strict, multi-step procedure to remove the toxic and indigestible parts. First, the outer skin of the bulb was peeled away, just like an onion. This rough, papery layer was inedible. Second, and most importantly, the bulb had to be cut in half. Inside, at the very center, was the small yellowish germ or future flower bud. This germ contains the highest concentration of the toxic compounds, primarily the allergen tulipalin A. It had to be meticulously carved out and discarded. Failure to do so would result in a meal that caused intense stomach cramps and a raw, burning sensation in the throat. Once the germ was removed, the remaining fleshy scales of the bulb could be processed. The most common method was to grate the bulb finely. This was crucial. Chopping or dicing the bulb left it in pieces that were too dense and they wouldn't cook properly, remaining bitter and hard. Grating increased the surface area, allowing for more even cooking and a breakdown of the complex carbohydrates. The grated pulp would discolor quickly, turning a brownish yellow, so it had to be used immediately. From here, there were 2 primary uses. The first was tulip bulb soup. A typical recipe from a soup kitchen involved frying a single chopped onion with a teaspoon of oil and any available spices, like a surrogate curry powder. 1 liter of water was added and brought to a boil. The grated tulip bulbs, about 4 or 5 per liter, were then stirred into the boiling water. The soup was cooked for a few more minutes until the grated pulp thickened the liquid slightly, creating a thin, starchy gruel. It was bland and had a starchy, slightly bitter taste, but it provided carbohydrates and a feeling of fullness. The second method was making tulip bulb bread. The grated bulbs were mixed with salt and a small amount of water to form a sticky, dense dough. Sometimes they were mixed with other fillers like potato peels or a tiny ration of actual flour if available. This dough was then flattened into small patties and cooked on a griddle or a hot stone until a dry, hard crust formed. The resulting bread was heavy, dense and difficult to eat, but it was a portable source of calories. Nutritionally, tulip bulbs offered very little beyond carbohydrates. They contain about 148 calories per 100 grams, similar to a potato, but lack significant vitamins or minerals. They were a source of bulk and energy, but not a solution to malnutrition. As one survivor noted, they filled the stomach, but did not nourish the body. Number 2. Sugar beets. Sugar beets were another cornerstone of the Hongerwinter diet, but they were a food source that came with their own set of technical challenges. These were not the common red beetroots found in gardens. The sugar beet is an industrial crop, grown specifically for its extremely high sucrose content, up to 20% by weight. It's a hard, white, fibrous root that is inedible raw for humans and normally processed in factories to extract sugar. With the factories closed and the transportation network paralyzed, the government began distributing raw sugar beets directly to the population and soup kitchens. The immediate problem was that the human digestive system is not equipped to break down the tough, fibrous structure of the raw beet. Consuming it unprepared would lead to severe stomach pain and digestive issues. Furthermore, the high concentration of sucrose, when not properly processed, could cause a sore, raw throat. Families had to become miniature sugar refineries in their own kitchens. The first step was cleaning and grating. The beets were scrubbed thoroughly to remove dirt and then had to be grated into a fine pulp. This was an exhausting, labor-intensive task. The root is incredibly hard, and families would spend hours grating enough beet to feed everyone. A standard kitchen grater would wear down quickly, and many people resorted to using improvised metal sheets with holes punched in them. Once grated, the most common use was to create a sugar beet syrup, stroop. The grated pulp was placed in a pot with a small amount of water and boiled for hours. This long, slow cooking process was necessary to break down the tough cell walls and release the sucrose. As the mixture cooked, the water would slowly evaporate, leaving behind a thick, dark, and intensely sweet syrup. This syrup could be eaten by the spoonful, spread on sawdust bread, or used to sweeten other famine foods. It was a pure shot of calories, providing immediate energy, but it was devoid of almost any other nutritional value. The leftover pulp from the syrup-making process was not discarded. This fibrous mash, now softened from boiling, was used as a filler. It could be mixed with grated tulip bulbs to make bread patties or added to soups to provide bulk. One of the more creative uses recorded was a form of ersatz nasi goreng, where the grated beet pulp was fried with spices to mimic the texture of rice. Another method was to make sugar beet cookies. The grated pulp was mixed with any available fat, if any could be found, and sometimes a pinch of salt. This mixture was shaped into small, flat cookies and baked until they were hard and dry. These were not sweet treats. They were hard, chewy, and often had a slightly bitter aftertaste, but they were a durable, portable source of calories. The primary contribution of sugar beets was calories in the form of sucrose. A single beet could provide a significant energy boost, which was critical for survival in the freezing cold. However, a diet heavy in sugar beets was damaging. The lack of fiber in the syrup led to digestive problems, and the intense sweetness combined with a lack of other nutrients did little to combat the deeper effects of starvation. Survivors often reported a constant gnawing hunger even after eating a meal of sugar beet pulp, a sign that their bodies were craving the vitamins, minerals, and proteins that this industrial crop could not provide. Number 3. Potato peels. In a world before the famine, potato peels were garbage. During the Hongerwinter, they became a fiercely contested resource. With whole potatoes being almost unobtainable for city dwellers, the peels discarded by those few who had access to them, such as German soldiers or black marketeers, were scavenged from bins and back alleys. But turning this waste product into food required specific knowledge to overcome toxins and make it digestible. The primary danger in potato peels is solanine, a glycoalkaloid poison. Solanine is naturally present in all parts of the potato plant, but its concentration is highest in the skin, sprouts, and any green parts. When potatoes are exposed to light, They turn green, which is an indicator of high solanine levels. Eating peels with high concentrations of this toxin could cause nausea, vomiting, and in severe cases, neurological problems. Families had to first meticulously inspect the peels, discarding any that were green or had started to sprout. This was a life-or-death sorting process. Once sorted, the peels had to be thoroughly washed. They were often collected from dirty bins or off the street, and they had to be scrubbed clean of dirt, mold, and other contaminants. This process used precious, clean water, which was itself a scarce resource. The most common method of preparation was potato peel soup. The cleaned peels were boiled in water for an extended period. The goal was not just to soften the peels, but also to leach out some of the bitterness and potential toxins into the water, which would then be discarded. After the first boil, the water was thrown out and fresh water was added. The peels were then boiled again, this time with salt if available, and any other scraps that could be found. A stray onion, a few leaves of a wild plant, or even a bone if someone was incredibly lucky. The soup was cooked until the peels were soft enough to be chewed. The resulting broth was thin and watery, but it carried the faint flavor of potato and provided a small amount of starch and potassium. Another method was to dry and fry the peels. After washing and sorting, the peels were laid out to dry completely. This was essential to prevent them from molding and to allow them to cook properly. Once dry, they could be fried in any available fat. A tiny amount of oil or animal fat would be heated in a pan, and the peels were fried until they were crispy. These fried peels were similar to modern potato skins, but they were often tougher and had a more bitter flavor. They provided a crucial source of fat and calories, and the crispy texture was a welcome relief from the endless diet of soft, boiled foods. For families with access to a small amount of flour, potato peels could also be used as a filler for bread. The peels were boiled until very soft, mashed into a pulp, and then mixed with flour and water to create a dough. This stretched the flour ration, allowing a family to make more bread than their ration would otherwise permit. The bread was dense and heavy, with a slightly earthy, bitter taste, but it was more substantial than bread made from flour alone. Nutritionally, potato peels contain a surprising amount of nutrients, including fiber, iron, vitamin C, and potassium. However, the nutritional value was often diminished by the preparation methods. The double boiling process, while necessary for safety, also leached out many of the water-soluble vitamins. Despite this, potato peels provided just enough nutritional variety to supplement the otherwise sterile diet of sugar and starch, helping to stave off the worst effects of scurvy and other deficiency diseases for a little while longer. Number 4. Common nettle. As the winter dragged on and supplies in the cities were completely exhausted, people turned to the hardiest wild plants that could survive in the urban landscape. The most important of these was the common nettle. While modern foragers prize nettles for their nutritional value, for the starving Dutch, it was a vital source of vitamins and minerals that could not be found anywhere else. But harvesting and preparing this plant required careful technique to neutralize its painful sting. Nettles are covered in tiny hollow hairs called trichomes, which act like hypodermic needles. When touched, they inject a cocktail of chemicals, including formic acid, causing a painful, burning rash. The first challenge was harvesting. People had to use gloves or thick cloth to handle the plants. If they had no protection for their hands, they would have to grasp the plant firmly and quickly, trying to crush the trichomes before they could inject their sting. They targeted the young, tender leaves at the top of the plant, as these were the most nutritious and the least fibrous. Once harvested, the nettles had to be processed to remove the sting. The stinging chemicals are neutralized by heat or by crushing. The most common method was boiling. The nettles were plunged into boiling water for several minutes. This not only destroyed the stinging trichomes, but also softened the leaves and made them more palatable. After boiling, the nettles could be used in a variety of ways. The most frequent preparation was nettle soup. After the initial boil, the nettles were drained and often chopped. They were then added to a pot of boiling water, often with potato peels or a few grated tulip bulbs to add substance. The soup was seasoned with salt if available and cooked until the nettles were completely tender. The resulting soup had a deep green color and a flavor similar to spinach, though more earthy and intense. It was a rich source of vitamins A and C, as well as iron, magnesium, and calcium, nutrients that were critically absent from the rest of the famine diet. Nettles were also prepared as a cooked green vegetable, similar to spinach. After being boiled to remove the sting, the water was squeezed out, and the nettles were chopped and could be eaten as is. If a family had a small amount of fat, the boiled nettles could be sautéed, which greatly improved the flavor and added much-needed calories. This simple dish was a powerhouse of nutrition and was one of the few sources of green vegetables available during the late winter and early spring. For those with a bit of creativity and a few extra ingredients, nettles could also be incorporated into other dishes. The boiled and chopped leaves could be mixed into sawdust bread dough or tulip bulb patties to add moisture and nutrients. This improved the texture of these otherwise dry and unpalatable foods and added a significant nutritional boost. The knowledge of how to identify, harvest, and prepare nettles was a critical piece of survival information. This was not common knowledge in the urbanized Netherlands of the 1940s. People had to rely on the older generation who remembered the foraging traditions of the past, or on government-issued pamphlets that provided information on edible wild plants. For many, a simple patch of nettles growing in a bombed-out lot or along a canal was the difference between succumbing to a deficiency disease and surviving until liberation. Number 5. Sawdust bread. When flour and grain became nothing more than a memory, bakeries and families were forced to create bread out of anything that could act as a filler. The most desperate of these creations was sawdust bread. This wasn't a case of simply adding a little sawdust to stretch the flour. This was a process of trying to create a loaf of bread when there was almost no flour at all. It represents the absolute limit of food improvisation, a point where the goal was simply to create something solid that could be chewed and swallowed to quiet the pains of an empty stomach. The key ingredient was, of course, sawdust, but not just any sawdust would do. The wood had to be from non-resinous trees, such as beech or birch. Pine and other conifers contain resins that are toxic and would make the bread completely inedible. The sawdust had to be ground into a very fine powder, essentially wood flour. This was a difficult process without industrial equipment, and the resulting powder was often coarse and gritty. The process of making sawdust bread was an exercise in binding agents. Wood flour has no gluten, so it will not form a dough on its own. It had to be mixed with other starchy, sticky materials that could hold it together. A typical recipe would start with a small, precious amount of actual wheat or rye flour, sometimes as little as 10% of the total volume. To this was added the wood flour. The binding agent was whatever could be found. Mashed boiled potato peels were a common addition. The starch from the peels would help to create a sticky consistency. Grated and boiled sugar beet pulp was also used, with the residual sugars helping to bind the mixture. In some cases, even boiled and mashed tulip bulbs were added to the mix. These ingredients were combined with water and a large amount of salt to create a thick, heavy paste. This dough was then shaped into loaves and baked. The baking process was long and required a low temperature. The goal was not to get the bread to rise, that was impossible, but to dry it out completely. The resulting loaf was incredibly dense, heavy, and hard. It had a dark color and a rough, gritty texture from the wood flour. The flavor was bland and earthy, with a persistent aftertaste of wood. Eating sawdust bread was a challenge. It was tough and difficult to chew, and it had to be eaten with large amounts of water or a thin soup to help it go down. It was also incredibly hard on the digestive system. The human stomach cannot break down cellulose, the primary component of wood. While the bread provided a feeling of fullness, it offered almost no nutritional value. The small amount of calories came from the flour, potato peels, or sugar beets that were mixed in, not from the sawdust itself. In many cases, it led to severe constipation and other digestive problems. Sawdust bread was the ultimate food of deception. It looked like bread, it could be sliced like bread, and it filled the stomach like bread. But it was an illusion of nourishment. It was a testament to the psychological need for a staple food, a symbol of normalcy in a world that was anything but normal. It kept the ritual of a meal alive, even when the food itself was a sham. For the people of the Hongerwinter, it was a final, desperate attempt to hold on to civilization, one gritty, unsatisfying bite at a time. As survivor Marga recalled years later, "It was tasteless because all food was without salt. There was no salt anymore. The salt mines in the east of the country were closed, and salt was kept in a safe. It was nearly priceless." These 5 foods were not meals. They were acts of defiance against starvation. They were the desperate, ingenious, and often dangerous solutions that ordinary people devised when their world collapsed. From the toxic flour in the garden to the sawdust on the floor, Dutch families used technical knowledge and sheer will to find calories where none should exist. They proved that in a true crisis, survival is not about what you have, it's about what you know. The knowledge to turn the inedible into the edible, the waste into the worthwhile. That is a skill that transcends history. If this episode opened your eyes to the forgotten techniques of survival, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which of these desperate foods surprised you the most. Subscribe and ring the bell because next episode we're diving into another chapter of human resilience that could save your life when everything else fails.